he writes comments on them, he can be like, fine, number these, you did crap. That's all I think.
And then I upload.
So you go later.
Sounds like also seems like a pretty common knowledge.
I think so.
I'm like,
Yeah, last week's was really good. There was just like 2 of the questions.
Well, you can do your whole thing with that.
see like a 4 out of 10 back to the G.
He's gonna look at me like stuff.
Combine it all with like 10%. So.
I just think it's marching. Yeah. Yeah, that's a hard
So we can tell you more.
It's just so stressful.
You can feel mad.
Yeah, it's like
Start to both words.
It's like I missed. I got 1 out of 10. It's like she's like, yeah, I literally wasn't here and I didn't know. It's like I'm surprised I didn't hear.
I was doing my debug yesterday. I saw them misplaced on the point.
So like one is quite locked. Like what is like drifting? What is the term? Steve and well, actually, it's just pictures. Like, there's not even any text on there. It's just pictures. Just put on the
well, what is
It's like where like the ship satellite thing is like where the ship is not where it actually is. So like
Wow.
I definitely think it's when you have two just the same.
Use a ask just like shit.
Comes up as if they're jumping.
Did they go like?
They're like,
Yeah. I thought you said that were. Or sometimes they go over land.
it's like a ship on like an easier where you have no idea you go ship.
That's a mistake. And then they show you like the video of people like carrying on
Try to see.
I'm not going to say fancy here.
Yeah, I moved. I think for what I have is. Yeah.
Although if it's actually
You edit the data.
In Excel, use RCD to make all these graphically.
so we can.
now it's open.
Oh wait, shit.
Yeah. I remember.
They almost do stuff.
I don't know. I haven't finished lunch from last night.
Yeah, I finished mine because I was like, I was sitting on me as well. I was on the final question.
Like the last one. You released the map.
Has he released them?
Yeah.
Really?
For the first one?
Yeah.
I'm not brave enough to look at that.
I'll get exactly. No, actually, yeah.
Is that okay for you guys? Yeah. I think that this lab
Yeah,
is
I was gonna
something
say
we
this. You could check in with them. Well, not like,
Yeah, we have. Where's that?
subject last week.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Still haven't heard anything.
I say you're
Usually you're not allowed to go to the library.
just think like, oh yeah.
You said you can live with one.
Strategy. I still have the content and no
Everything else is good. I got all of the data and everything.
Institutional laptop, which means it's a time to so your bedroom.
So I'm not too sure, like,
It's an
if I can put like news articles.
Yeah, you
Right,
can.
no, it's wrong on
It's
it.
great.
It's just like weird. It's just like,
it's
why you
really
can't do that?
It's
You reach 30
it goes
and
through
you
the whole
can't read
reading
it.
system.
And it's also like weird, like, cause I know, like, usually in the discussion section, like, you don't like reference anything really much, and it's like, in the introduction, it's kind of it's hard to talk about something that's way like I don't know, it's hard not to bring any information.
Have you figured out how to ask us about it?
What's this thing that's in the references in the just ask you.
Yeah.
If you want to contrast something so
You do it in a discussion.
but it's fun to do as well.
You
Well, comparing two things is a discussion. That's another place.
Yeah, but I mean, like, let's say one say 20 tons and the other one say like 50,000 tons.
yeah, so you got till
You want to like compare, you're not going to put like big numbers in your discussion. So like, let's say you've got two reports and then one say,
So you're taking data from two different.
yeah, and then like you want to contrast like, but you can explain why it's well, you found this figure somewhere.
Oh yeah. Because then you don't really put anything in the discussion section. Like, you don't really, it's weird to put a graph in the discussion section.
We've got 14 and a half.
Out of
60.
awesome. Yes.
But he doesn't, but then
But you don't
So
know
should
right what you're wrong.
you're not better.
Yeah, I never said I was better.
If you no, I forgot to use one battery.
But I don't know if it's just because I was massively assuming limit for the last 3 questions because he gave them half marks on each of those. The first one was within the word limit.
Oh, you mean my total?
Oh, does it not say?
No, it gives you like the total like numbers.
Yeah.
And I have 57, which is
But is that weighted?
I don't know.
Oh.
But I usually do the
That's
way
just, I think
it's
that's just the total one.
Oh yeah, I've done like
Of this one?
Library.
Actually, I
Library.
feel like I need to actually stay for that because the last time I got my
people got this.
Yeah, the word's the last one.
Oh,
Last
very
week's
good.
this.
No, I'm saying that.
It wasn't as bad the first week or the first week. No, it was not me. She's with it. We didn't read it.
No, the first one. No, it's like you got 5. I got 6. The thing is like, You know, when they're confused, it's like we with the meteorology.
So like half the questions are based around that, so we just got them all wrong.
I don't know where to click. I think last week was the
You sent an email. Did you?
No, because we realized like straight after. I didn't actually send it until like, and then like you finished yours and we like, oh wait, so you're actually wrong here. Because we felt like the question was wrong. You're like, oh yeah, wait, no, I forgot wind and currents.
That obviously the confusing. That's the same question, but then did a different.
Are those last two?
Yeah, so it but it said a different thing, so I just assumed it. I'm not listening. The same answer, and then it was only when I went back and I read it.
Okay, guys.
I think I got it.
Technology, obviously, you know me. Technology and me are like fire and water. I'd like to introduce Nathan Harrison. He's the Director of Fisheries Management or Aquatic Resource Management for WA Fisheries. And while I sort out technology adversary here, he will start talking. Oh, wait, you need to.
So it's recorded.
And the slides will catch up.
I will catch up with you on the slides.
All good?
You can put them on LMS and then we can have them out.
I think you will get them on LMS. But
Okay, thanks, Dirk. We'll make a start. As Dirk said, my name's Nathan Harrison. I'm the Director for Fisheries Management with DPIRD. DPIRD's effectively three organisations that have been pulled together under a sort of super agency. So we used to be just a standalone fisheries agency. Now DPIRD is regional development, agriculture and fisheries brought together. So my role, I oversee the fisheries management program for Western Australia. So my responsibility is looking after basically all the extractive fisheries in the state. Also get involved with marine planning, biosecurity in fisheries space, and a few other things as well in the aquaculture space. But really the key area of responsibility is that extractive fisheries management role. If you look at the, I guess, what fisheries under DPIRD is responsible for, we have two acts currently in place at the moment. One's the Fish Resources Management Act, 1994, and the other one is the Pearling Act 1990. So they're the two pieces of legislation that we operate under. And in relation to the Fish Resources Management Act, the Fisheries Resource Management Act 1994, that covers the sustainable management of basically all fisheries and aquatic resources. So when you think of fisheries, some people just think of, bony fish, snapper, jewfish, those sorts of things. The responsibilities for fisheries extends well beyond that. So we are obviously responsible for those types of species, bony fish, fish with fins like sharks and rays, but then we're also responsible for invertebrates, whether it's prawns, rock lobster, coral, algae, live rock. Basically anything that's living in the ocean really comes under our responsibility, and then we'll have management plans in place for the extraction of those different types of resources. Basically within Western Australia we're quite fortunate that we have a fairly developed fisheries management program, and also supported by a fairly comprehensive research program, monitoring program. So within Western Australia currently the resources we've got, 95% of them are managed in a sustainable way. That's where you've actually got assessment saying that the fishery is managed in a sustainable manner. You're meeting your targets. For those 5%, we actually have resource recovery strategies in place. You might be aware of one that's been quite topical recently, which is the demersal scalefish resource on the west coast. That's jewfish, snapper, bulging groper. That's an example of one fishery or resource where we've got a recovery plan in place to actually make sure that fishery is sustainable in the long term. So I think that it's important just to acknowledge that when you actually look at Western Australia and what we have in place with our fisheries and management and science program, it's actually quite different to what's happening in other parts of the world. People will often look at media and other things and think, well, okay, the fish stocks are being overfished. We need more closed areas to manage them, or need to take action. what's happening in West Australia is quite different, and in many parts of the developed world where you actually have, or the fortune of having, developed fisheries management programs. So what's happening in WA isn't necessarily reflected about what's happening in, say, for example, third world countries or areas where there is no fisheries management program. So certainly that's something that just to be mindful of. Right, caught up. Okay, go to the next slide. Bioregions. Go back one. Bioregions. I'll just touch on this in relation to what we actually manage. So obviously the Fisheries Department or DPIRD is responsible for the management of the entire state. So it's 1,300 kilometres of coastline. That presents a lot of different challenges. We manage not just the coastal waters, which is the state territorial waters out to 3 nautical miles. Under the offshore constitutional settlement, we actually manage out to 200 nautical miles. So we manage all those fisheries that extend beyond state waters, with the exception of the tuna and billfish fishery, which is a Commonwealth managed fishery. Does anyone know why the Commonwealth would manage a fishery and not us, like tuna and billfish?
Tuna comes under the special act of, don't remember the name, but it's more of a globe because it's more globally spread, so it comes under a global branch rather than a state or federal branch.
Yep. And if you think of the migratory nature of tuna and billfish, there's international agreements between us, Japan, New Zealand around the sharing of the stock. Because of those migratory patterns and looking at the take in other jurisdictions, it makes more sense for the Commonwealth to be managing that fishery rather than it being managed by the state. I'll go to the next slide. When it comes to sustainable management, there are 3 key resource areas that we really have as far as extraction or producing food, if you like, and they're the ones that we actually really manage to in Western Australia. So we've got the commercial fisheries, we've got recreational and also aquaculture, and I'll talk a little bit about each of those different areas and what they actually mean for how we actually go about managing them, and some of the key considerations that are involved in each of the different sectorial groups. Yep, Dirk, and flick to the next one. When it comes to commercial fishing, we've got around 50 commercial fisheries in Western Australia, generating around 400 million. It was generating over 600 million a couple of years ago. The reason why there's been a substantial drop really comes down to this rock lobster that was substantially reduced in value, and that's as a result of does anyone know why?
Because of China?
China. Yep, so global tensions after COVID, China took action to basically restrict the import of a range of different products from Australia. Timber, beef, wine, lobster was one of them. So the fishery is still operating effectively now. Rather than being able to export their product into China, it's actually still going into China, but it's going through what we call grey channels. So largely being flown into Taiwan at the moment. From Taiwan, it then makes its way into China. And other times it's gone through Vietnam or other countries to circumvent some of those trade restrictions. So that's why there's been a substantial reduction in that value, because what happens is if you, say for example, are exporting directly into Beijing, flying the product in, fishermen were getting $75, $80, up to $100 a kilo. At the moment, they're getting about $35 to $40 a kilo because of that supply chain issue and how you're actually getting the product in and who you're paying for to get that product across different borders.
Does China know that that's happening?
Of course they do.
Yeah.
It's an issue with a lot of products that effectively, before there was trade barriers removed, a lot of product used to go through Hong Kong, and it was effectively called the grey market, and there would be movement of product through Hong Kong. Now with Hong Kong and becoming sort of part of wider, part of China, and coming into that sort of that political space, it's been harder to move product through. But then once the free trade was in place, there was opportunity to export the product directly into Beijing. So if you look at rock lobster, at the moment they have a take of about 6,300 tonnes. They're moving that up to 7,300 tonnes this year. That's all going by live export, okay, in planes. and at the moment it's going into Taiwan. But if you actually think about that, you think about 7,000 tonnes, you think, well, okay, you've got 50 weeks of the year, you've got over 100 tonnes a week, you know, moving out of the country. That's several jumbo jets flying with nothing but lobster into other countries. So belly loading will be one of the issues where they have normal commercial flight. At the moment, there's 2 Cathay flights that they'll take passengers, but they'll also take rock lobster. When the COVID restrictions were in place and there was no passengers, there were planes leaving Western Australia with nothing but lobster on them. Okay, 50 tonnes of lobster, 30 tonnes of lobster going on a plane. So that's sort of what happens with some of these fisheries.
Sorry, my computer is shutting me down. So I'll reboot.
Okay, I'll keep going. So yeah, when you look at the fisheries, it's dominated in a commercial value sense by the rock lobster fishery in Western Australia. We have other invert trawl fisheries, which is really around prawns and scallop that have other high value catches. They're centred around places like Shark Bay and also Exmouth, where the 2 key prawn fisheries are. And you know, they'll contribute about $30 million a year in landed value. There's a lot of pressure on those sorts of fisheries, and it's not just about how the fishery is actually performing from a point of view of the catch. Aquaculture is playing a significant impact on, or having a significant impact on some of the prawn fisheries because of the quantity of prawns that are being imported. Then you're competing with a wild caught or wild capture product versus an aquaculture product that might be cheaper to produce in other countries. So that issue of trying to actually look at having you know, product substitutes and things like that is something that bears into the economic realities of fishing and whether or not fisheries are actually profitable. Has anyone got any idea about how much, even though we've got rock lobster, we've got, you know, herring and whiting and jewfish, what the quantity of seafood that's consumed in Western Australia might be imported? Any idea?
70%.
As a percent?
Roughly 70%.
70?
Yeah.
Yep, 70-80% of the seafood we consume is actually imported. So high value fish, rock lobster, prawns, scallops are actually exported largely. You know, the domestic market for rock lobster is only probably about 200 tonnes. You think about a 7,000 tonne fishery, the rest of it's being exported. But when it comes to a lot of the finfish and other things like that, and you're looking at products like bassa, tilapia, that are being produced through Southeast Asia, that's certainly taking up the majority of what people actually consume. It's also worthwhile thinking about, when you think about the West Australian coast, we have like largely pristine, you know, marine environment. You go down to Cottesloe or you go down swimming and you think, well, okay, some of our beaches are the best in the world, and you look at the water. They're actually really low in productivity by world standards. Our coastline is really low in productivity, and that's something that people don't quite often understand. They think that you have clean oceans, you should have oceans teeming with fish. But it's actually more about what's actually happening in the water. So we don't have, on the West Australian coast, significant river systems pushing nutrient into the water. The nutrient adds to the productivity, okay? Or we don't have strong currents pushing up the coast, like you have, say, for example, off the coast of Africa. On the east side, you'll have, you know, very strong nutrient-rich current that's coming up all the way from Antarctica, basically pushing nutrient-rich current up. We just really have an absence of those currents on the WA coast, don't have those big river systems. So what you see on the land in Western Australia is almost really what's reflected in the ocean. So the sustainable take for our fisheries, when you're looking at things like jewfish, snapper, you know, those sorts of key species, or red emperor up north, we measure their sustainable take in really hundreds of tonnes a year, as opposed to something like you say in the North Sea, you know, with the herring stock, you know, and other fisheries where they're highly productive. You're looking at tens of thousands of tonnes will be the sustainable catch that you can have out of those fisheries. On the West Australian coast, we don't have that productivity, so we have to have a fairly conservative approach to the management of our fish resources. The only difference really is probably the benthic habitat, particularly along the west coast, which is largely limestone, and the algal growth on that habitat means that we have quite a productive rock lobster fishery. Okay, and that's why we've got 7,000 tonnes of rock lobster coming out a year. But the water column itself, the water column above the seafloor, really doesn't produce a lot. That's why we have fairly conservative fisheries management arrangements in place. And then when something happens where a fishery is overfished, we have to take significant management action to actually make sure that that fishery is back on track. And I'll talk a little bit more about the demersal scalefish fishery a little bit later. In relation to recreational fishing, and fisheries management is by far and away not just about commercial fisheries and what's sustainable and taking action with quotas and how many boats are in the water, things like that. Recreational sector, has anyone got any idea how many people in West Australia fish each year, wet a line? A couple of million? We only got a couple of million people in Western Australia. Okay, about 600,000-700,000 people, go fishing each year in Western Australia. So it's around, it varies between, a quarter to a third of the population will wet a line or go fishing for crabs or things like that, or go diving, trying to catch fish. When you think about that, and you think, well, okay, at least a quarter of the population is going fishing. The first thing is that obviously they can be, in some cases, having a significant impact on the stock. When it comes to prawns and scallops, no, people don't really take that. Rock lobster, the wrecks take about 5% of the catch. When it comes to demersal scalefish like jewfish and snapper and things, they can be taking up to 50% of the catch. Therefore, you've got to actually factor them into fisheries management. You've got to make sure that what they're taking is sustainable. And that gets challenging when you've got so many people involved in the fishery. Then you go to the extreme, you might have, say, for example, the marron fishery in the southwest. That's 100% recreational. So there's different places and areas that the recreational sector intersect with. The most popular recreational species to target is probably blue swimmer crabs. More people actually go fishing for blue swimmer crabs, in places like the Swan River or Mandurah, because it's accessible, and that's something which is highly valued. Other abundant species, sand whiting, herring, those sorts of species are also highly targeted. But when it comes to demersal scalefish, jewfish, snapper, there's probably a group of maybe about 20,000 people through our surveys that are avid fishers, highly effective, very efficient in actually going out there catching fish. They are taking about 50% of the demersal scalefish catch. So managing for avids is something which you actually think, well, okay, how do you actually make decisions and rules in place that actually have an impact on those people who are highly efficient and actually go out fishing more often than not. So managing recreational fishing is challenging. It's also one of those things which is highly political when it comes to fishing and fisheries management. Often the science can tell you something. It can tell you, okay, the fishery's being overfished, you need to take action. You've got to reduce the number of boats, you've got to stop people fishing, you've got to have a closed season. Yeah, okay, it's pretty easy. It's all about political support and community support. Because if you think about managing 600,000 people out there, you can't have a fisheries officer on every boat ramp and every jetty. You've got to actually make sure that people understand the science, understand the reasons why you're taking action, and that you actually have a positive change in their behaviour, that they actually support the management and they say, okay, we'll do the right thing. So education with the recreational sector is absolutely critically important. And having community support for what you do is really important, because in the absence of that, if you don't have community support, often you're not going to get political support. Politicians don't want to do things which are highly unpopular. And that's where fisheries management gets really challenging. And it's actually not so much sometimes about just managing the fish and actually saying, well, okay, the decision's easy, we can reduce the catch here and there. It's actually getting political support to actually take action and make change. And that's the real challenge with fisheries management. And what you're often doing is presenting a case. And you're trying to look at mounting an argument for why you should take action and what the risk of not taking action is when you're dealing with ministers and governments around those sorts of things. So it can be quite challenging in that space when it comes to looking at managing recreational fishing and getting support for what you're actually doing. It would be good if we had the slide up, but when you look at the fisheries, when you look at fisheries management, and you actually think about, okay, we have commercial management plans in place for our commercial fisheries, and they will define who has access to that. So, for example, what boats can operate, what gear they can operate, if there's seasonal closures, things like that. They are contained within a fisheries management plan, which is a legislative document that really sets out the governance for the operation of that fishery. For the RECs, we have regulations in place under the Act. It might be things like bag limits, size limits, type of gear you can use, how many hooks, those sorts of things. So in combination, we've got arrangements in place for recreational fishing and commercial fishing. But what's really important is actually to bring them together, because when you're talking about fisheries management, you cannot manage one sector in isolation and think you'll actually have a positive outcome. So integrated fisheries management is really important, and what we try and use to bring that together is really a harvest strategy, and that harvest strategy actually looks at the stock performance, and so where the stock is actually travelling at a particular point in time and what management action you should be taking if that stock is depleted. It also sets out the catch shares, so the relative shares for the recreational and the commercial sector, or if you've got some stuff that you're setting aside for brood stock, or if there is some stuff or catch that's set aside for customary fishing as well. So those sorts of things are covered in the harvest strategy, but it also goes further to actually looking at some of the habitat issues. So for example, if a commercial fishery is having impact on the habitat and also bycatch species. So for example, with a trawl fishery, what are you catching? Are you catching any turtles, or are you having any interaction with...
Where are you at?
Keep going. Back one. So this is what I was talking about with the harvest strategy. This is one aspect of the harvest strategy, which is looking at really the stock performance. So as I said, there are a range of other things in that harvest strategy that cover off on interactions with protected species, the allocation of shares. But this is really important to get your head around, that once you have those allocations, then you say, well, okay, how's the stock tracking? And what we'll often have is a reference to a target, a threshold, and a limit that you'll come across when it comes to fisheries management. So the target is really that's the green zone up here. So if you're in that zone where the stock's performing well, you're okay. Your fisheries management is okay, and the fishery is being fished sustainably. And that will often be for many species that you have to have at least 40% of the spawning biomass, that's available there in the water. Once you start coming down to the threshold, where you're getting down to only about 30% of the stock in the water, then you're starting to get into the danger zone. So, okay, we really need to take some management action here to get that fishery back up above the target. Once you come down into the limit, you only got 20% of the stock available, that's really the absolute red zone, and you have to take management action to avoid the fishery absolutely collapsing. So that threshold, or the target, the threshold and the limit are key concepts within that harvest strategy, which is supported by other governance arrangements. And that's really probably becoming the standard as best practice, having a harvest strategy. It's also a requirement for things like MSC, Marine Stewardship Council certification. So we've got 10 of our commercial fisheries which are certified under MSC. We were the first first jurisdiction in the world to get MSC certification for the rock lobster fishery. So that was the first fishery to ever get MSC certification. But having those sorts of issues around allocation, looking at interactions with the environment, looking at what we call P2 species. P1 will be the target species you're actually catching. P2 are like the bycatch species, and then there's environmental impacts, looking at the habitat on the benthic floor, things like that, interactions, that are all covered in the harvest strategy. We'll go to the next one. And I'll just touch on this, because I know that you're getting some talks later on fisheries monitoring and stock assessment, but it's worthwhile looking at, say for example, with some species like rock lobster or abalone, it's a bit easier to actually manage that because it's a single species. Okay, you're managing, you're setting management arrangements around a single species. So it's easier to determine what the stock, and the stock level might be for that particular species and manage it. Where it gets more challenging is when you're talking about multi-species fisheries. You can't manage, this was the example I've used with the jewfish snapper and ball-chin groper, which is some of the key species on the west coast. So when you look at the demersal scalefish species on the west coast, where we have a current sustainability issue, and I'll touch on that in the next couple of slides, we can't go out there and assess every species. there's over 100 species that are caught. You can't go and do a stock assessment and say, well, okay, how's every species travelling? So what we tend to use in multi-species, particularly scalefish fisheries, is to use indicator species. So in this case, we've taken jewfish snapper and bulging groper as the 3 indicator species. If we say if we can do a comprehensive stock assessment on those 3 indicator species, and if they're in good health, then largely those other species, the lesser species which form, part of the catch but not the majority, they'll probably be performing okay. So the use of indicator species is something that we often use with fisheries management, where you have a multi-species fishery and you're trying to look at what actually is taken, across the board. And a lot of it is around risk management, as I said, and often with some of our fisheries, we're operating in a data poor environment. Fisheries management is not about, like counting the number of sheep in a paddock. It's very hard to do that. You're often looking at a range of lines of evidence around what you should do around a particular fish stock. So having some understanding about how the fishery is performing is one thing, but looking at other aspects like technology, for example, there's the use of colour sounders, GPS systems. The recreational fishery is using chemically sharpened hooks, braided line. There's the internet, there's a sharing of information. Even in the commercial sector, often with the commercial fisheries, we'll allow maybe a 5% efficiency gain every year. The power of the engines they're using, the type of material they're making their trawl nets out of, that's increasing efficiency within a fishery. So with when you're coming to actually looking at presenting a case, and you can say, well, okay, the science is one aspect. But it's really a weight of evidence approach that you have to take in fisheries management. And that's critical to actually then prosecuting your argument with politicians, with sector bodies, things like that, about what should be done. It's really bringing together all that relevant information to say, this is the risk of really if we don't do this, this is the risk of actually, not taking that action. So think of that weight of evidence and mounting that argument. And this is really where we're at with the demersal scalefish fishery. What had happened is that we took action back in around 2010 to take action to reduce the catch by about 50%. We were effective in doing that, but what actually showed with the stock was that it was back here, we stopped the decline, and the measures were effective in actually stopping that, but we didn't actually restrict the catch enough to actually boost the fishery back up on a recovery phase. So this was the argument that we had to present to the community, to the sector bodies, and to politicians, that basically this fishery is right down here in the red zone, and that we had arrested the decline, but we hadn't actually kicked the fishery back up into recovery. So normally with these sorts of fisheries, we have a 20-year recovery plan. For some species, say for example prawns, crabs, they're an annual crop. So you can actually look at saying, well, okay, how's the fishery tracking? What's going to be the catch next year? What's the level of residual biomass that you need to make sure that you've got that breeding stock to actually provide that catch for the following year. With demersal scalefish, like jewfish, snapper, they live to 40 years of age. Okay, so right out to 40 years. They have variable recruitment. They don't have the same number of juveniles each year. You'll get environmental conditions that mean that they will have maybe a really successful spawning every 5 to 7 years. So you get this variable recruitment in the fishery with juveniles coming through. Long-lived, slow-growing, to enable a recovery to occur, you're looking at a 20-year period for these sorts of species. So it's not just about today or tomorrow, it's about a long-term view about how you try and recover these fisheries. And this is just a picture of which is helping inform the fishery and how it's performing, is just the age structure. And the age structure for demersal scalefish or many finfish is really what you use as the basis for your stock assessment. And we get that by actually aging the otoliths out of the ear bones of the fish, have rings similar to a tree trunk. You can put them under a microscope, cut them and see the age of the fish. You also need to get adequate and representative sample size than from the commercial and the recreational fishery when you're sampling to look at the age structure. So for the West Coast bioregion, we divide it into the South Coast, the Metro Zone, Midwest and Kalbarri Zone. So the West Coast bioregion we actually divide into 4 areas, and we need at least 400 samples from each area to get an adequate representative sample from each of those different, of those different species by area. So you can see what's happening here with jewfish is that basically once you got to 15 years of age, there's almost no fish left in the population. Okay, so the recovery plan is actually about protecting some of these fish and allowing them to grow through into being older fish and then contributing more to the spawning biomass and reducing that risk. Because as I said, if you only have good recruitment every 5 to 7 years, if you fish down this, these 4 or 5 years of strong recruitment and there's nothing coming behind them, very quickly you can have a situation where you have to take drastic action to actually close the fishery for a long period of time. South Australia is doing that, with their snapper fishery where they've overfished it. They had to shut it for 5 years, but it might be literally 10 to 15 years to allow and protect those fish so that they can actually take advantage of decent spawning conditions when they come around. So that can be the consequence of actually not taking action when you get those triggers or signals that you do need to take some action. Yep. How do we change management? I've talked around this a bit so far today, but often, as I said, the solutions can be quite easy to identify when you actually come to a data poor fishery or you've got some information that say you need to take some action. But we have in Western Australia a number of peak sector bodies that represent the commercial fishing interests, represent recreational fishing interests, represent aquaculture. So for the commercial sector, we've got 2. One is the Western Rock Lobster Council, and they just represent the rock lobster industry. WAFIC, the West Australian Fishing Industry Council, represent all the other commercial fisheries. RecFish West represent the rec sector, and we also have a group called Aqua that represents the aquaculture sector. So they are the industry sources of advice to government. So they are often involved in actually certainly the consultation process, getting them an understanding of actually what's happening, and then working in the rec sector through the community and beyond RecFish West to actually make sure that people have an understanding about what's going on. And as I said, it's absolutely critical that when it comes to the science and what you might understand is happening with a fishery and it's involving or affecting so many different people, particularly when you look at the recreational sector and the charter fishery, if you're saying, okay, we're going to shut this down for 6 months, you're saying to charter operators you can't operate, my business is going to go under, all those sorts of things where really you have to actually sell. The first thing you do in fisheries management is you have to sell the science. You have to tell the story about what's actually happening with this fishery and why you need to take management action. And that's why community engagement, consultation is so important. Because if you have, it doesn't matter whether it's in a West Australian context, Australian or internationally, if you don't get acceptance and support for the science that underpins the decisions that you have to make, you'll go through this long consultation process with the peak sector bodies, the community and all the affected people, and then they'll come back and they'll just argue about the science and say your science is wrong. So you have to get, in fisheries management, you really need to make sure that you get that understanding and acceptance of the science up front in your discussions and in your engagement so people understand there is a problem. They might argue around who should get what share of the catch, whether it's a commercial or that's fine, you can deal with that. But fundamentally, you have to get people to understand that there is a problem and why that management action is actually needed to be taken. So consultation in fisheries management is really important. Community engagement is really important. As I said, being a fisheries manager is more about actually managing relationships. It's more about actually engaging with the politicians and actually mounting a case for action and dealing with those sorts of things. The fish can look after themselves, managing people, and at the end of the day, as I talked about recreational fishing, getting a change and a positive change in people's behaviour is actually what you're actually trying to do. So it's actually trying to be, not an expert, but actually deliver positive change in people's behaviour and how they act towards the resource, and do they act in the sense of stewardship, and do they do the right thing, with fisheries that they're actually involved with. So education, changing behaviour, and also that leading to that political support. And often in an academic way, people will say, well, okay, if you don't have that data, if you don't know quite what's happening, but you've got signals that you should be taking action. And often people talk about the precautionary approach, that the precautionary approach says that in the absence of data shouldn't stop you actually taking action. And I can remember I was dealing with one minister quite a few years ago, and we had some problems with the Shark Bay pink snapper fishery. And I started talking to him about the precautionary approach. He's a minister. He's dealing with all of his electorate and all the people who go up there camping and all the businesses. And he goes, I don't care about the precautionary approach, and don't come into this office telling me about the precautionary approach. I want you to tell me what the risk is of having a bag limit of 1. That's it. You tell me what the risk is, because I've got all these communities, I've got all these people that are resting on my decision. So then you have to actually change the argument. You say, well, okay, this is what we know, this is what we understand. If we take this action, this is what the future might look like, all right? If we don't take this action now, then the consequence of taking more significant action becomes such a more real and potential significant outcome, where you're not going to be shutting this fishery for a year or 2 years, you're going to be shutting it for 10 years. So understanding risk is absolutely critical in a fisheries management sense, and particularly to decision makers, and looking at that risk management and what that looks like is really central to the discussions that you have, rather than just talking about a term that might say, well, okay, this is what you should do in a certain sense. It's really about understanding risk and managing risk, which is absolutely critical. Key issues moving forward. I just thought I'd touch on this because it is an evolving space constantly when you actually look at fisheries management in WA, and it's not something that's static, and you have to be adaptive. Adaptive fisheries management is critical. You can't just sit there and say, okay, we'll set this, it will remain in stone. There are so many dynamic influences in fisheries management that are changing things on a constant basis. Certainly when you look at some of the population growth, coastal developments are really obviously having an impact on the nearshore environment, the amount of people who are accessing the resource. When you build new marinas and things like that, you say, well, okay, that might be great for people that they can have another 1,000 boats launching each week, but then you have to actually manage the consequences of that. When you look at, say, coastal development, I just got a picture of the abalone reef that's there, or abalone fishes, in the area around Ocean Reef. There was a decision made to actually say, well, okay, we're going to build a new marina at Ocean Reef, which is under construction at the moment. And that was the most important area for abalone in the metropolitan area. Okay, so that area took out about 70 tonnes of abalone just by that one development. Okay, 70 tonnes of abalone. Already the abalone fishery for the recreational sector, we managed to only 4 fishing periods a year, 1 hour each period. It's one of the most tightly managed, fisheries in the world. And normally the recreational sector will take about 6 tonnes of abalone per hour collecting on the reef. One development, that's the total stock that they took out. Obviously you come back to looking at the, what's the allowable take each year. But those are the sorts of things where have really significant impacts on saying, well, okay, is it going to go from 4 hours fishing a year to 3 and down to 15 tonnes or less? Those are things that can really have a significant impact on fisheries management. The coastal development stuff is also, and really land management practices are having a huge impact in the southwest. We've got a drying climate in the southwest, in particular, less rainfall each year, but with the damming of our rivers and some of the land management practices around agriculture have meant that there's less runoff. The estuary systems are nowhere near as productive as they used to be in the southwest. All the key river systems, even the Swan River, which is turning into far more of a marine environment. At the moment, we've got one commercial fisherman that really just targets crabs in the Swan River. I don't know if any of you have read any of Tim Winton's books and things like that, talking about Cloud Street and things like that. At one stage, we have over 50 commercial fishers operating in the Swan River. Now we've got one. Same thing down in Peel Harvey, Mandurah, there was over 100 operating down there. Now there's about 4. So certainly coastal development has a significant impact, and part of it's also linking into resource sharing and who gets the share of the resource. Is it commercial fishing? Is it recreational fishing? And that value proposition is changing all the time. You know, and you actually look at saying in a fisheries management, how do you actually manage and share a resource to achieve the best outcome for the West Australian community? And that's what you have to think about when you're looking at managing resources. So, well, okay, what share should be taken by the commercial sector? For rock lobster, it's pretty easy. You say, well, okay, the wrecks catch around 500 tonnes a year. There's 50,000 people that take out a recreational rock lobster licence. The domestic supply, as in consumed by backer boat sales or people going to a fish shop, is about 150 tonnes. There's a 7,000 tonne fishery. The value is in the commercial sector in taking the majority of that catch and the export dollars and things like that that it brings in. But then it comes to demersal scale fish, and you say, well, okay, you've got about 10, 15 boats, you've got 20,000, 30,000 people that are going out there fishing. You know, those 15 boats are providing, restaurants, fishmongers, things like that, with people with a meal or feed of fish if they want to buy it. Where's the return to the community? And that's where it gets really political. We actually start arguing over, or different sectors argue over what it is that should be taken. And when it comes to the department's role, it's not our role to advocate for one sector over another. We need to actually be impartial and enforce whatever the decisions of government are at the end of the day. And so that's where it can be challenging sometimes in a fisheries context where you may not actually like something, but you've got to actually deal with what those decisions are by the government. As I talked about, technology shifts, GPS, large boats, better weather forecasts, those sorts of things are always improving and increasing the efficiency of people's fishing, commercial or recreational. So factoring in those into your sustainable fisheries management arrangements is important. And this is something which is really coming more to the fore, which is climate change, climate variability. We're really seeing that that's having a greater impact in fisheries management now, and trying to make sure that our fisheries are more resilient to climate change. We're having more and climate change. People, I guess, in a wider sense, there's the talk of climate change. There's talk of warming of the Earth or oceans and other things like that. Climate variability is a constant in fisheries management. You're constantly dealing with it, always have been, in the sense that you'll get changes in water, sea surface temperature. You'll get changes in the strength of the lure and current flowing down the coast that has an impact then on the distribution of fish larvae and eggs. But we're seeing more and more extreme weather events with marine heat waves, things like that are really significantly impacting on a range of fisheries. Shark Bay, for example, which is really sort of at a midpoint between the tropics and the more temperate waters, there are some really significant things happening in that fishery with the prawn fishery, the amount of seagrass and things like that that are being impacted by environmental factors. If we look at some of the others, abalone is a classic one. Marine heat wave in 2011 basically killed the entire abalone resource that was located from Kalbarri all the way down to just north of Moore River. Through the Midwest we had abalone that were basically present on all those reefs. Marine heat wave wiped them out. They're not going to come back. There's not got any residual biomass there to actually support that stock rebuilding. We will look at reseeding and doing things like that, but climate change and variability is certainly playing a significant impact. And probably one of the significant drivers on the west coast is the lure and current. The lure and current it's not a nutrient-rich current, but it's a current that flows down the West Australian coast that will be influenced by Indian Ocean dipole, La Nina, El Nino type events. At the moment, we're coming into probably a time where it's going to start to weaken. That will have a significant impact on, say, for example, rock lobster or scallops, herring, Australian salmon. If you think of anyone here caught herring or salmon, Australian salmon, yep, a couple of people. Okay, if you think of herring, they migrate, Australian herring, small fish, often people catch it as their first fish that they catch on a line.